We have another speaker, Professor Peter Le Souef, who is a professor of paediatrics at the University of Western Australia. He's co-author, as you've seen from the paper citations, and leads the Future Child Health Research Team. And he's now going to talk a little bit more about the wider impact of children.
Thanks. Years ago, where we started thinking about it. I'm a paediatrician, and I've done global health research, and I've traveled to many countries in every continent and collaborated with people on it and child health. It became readily apparent over the years that I've been traveling that climate was getting worse, that poverty was getting worse in many places where there was crowding, and started to realize that what do we know about child health and what was going to happen in the future. Next. If you look at the global picture and just look at these slides, some of which Melinda's already talked about, infant mortality is high on the top left panel in equatorial regions. In those same regions, climate change impacts are greatest. And in the same regions, population increase is greatest. And in the very same regions, malnutrition is also already very common. And Melinda did her PhD in South and East Africa, and the number of children with stunting was over 30% that she looked at. So it's a scenario where high mortality already, things are going to get, climate impacts are there and probably going to get worse. Population is going to increase, but there are not the resources really to look after that issue. When we started this research, we started to realize that really there was very little known about this area. There were very few publications, and we decided that to call our group Future Child Health, because we'd be looking at what was going to happen in the future to child health, and that's been the focus of our work, and particularly for the last 4 years, where we've been looking at what's going to happen to children this century in the face of all of the challenges that are happening with climate change, as well as degradation of the environment, as well as population dynamics changing quite dramatically this century. Next, please. One of the things I want to emphasize is that the climate is really getting worse, and this is data from the northwest tip of Tasmania, which is down here, and that's a place called Cape Grim, which is somewhat prophetically named. It gets the cleanest air in the world. It comes across the Southern Ocean, and it's an admixture of all the air in the world. And it takes only a few weeks for everything to mix up and come across the Southern Ocean. There's no countries out west, and so that we get very good idea of what's happening to CO2 levels. And you can see on the graph that the CO2 levels have been increasing. And if you have a look, it's gradually increasing faster. And what's worse is that since Paris, when there was a Paris Agreement, and since COVID, which was expected to decrease CO2 levels, but in fact, from the data in Cape Grim, didn't show any deviation at all. If it is, it's imperceptible to the eye. But not only that, since then, not only is it increasing, but the rate is increasing. So the rate of use of fossil fuel or our ability, or the planet's ability to absorb CO2 through photosynthesis has been eroding, so that CO2 levels are increasing. Next. So there's currently a mantra that if we use renewables, that will take over, and we can then continue on the path that we're continuing on by having renewable energy, and it will solve our problems. But let me just point to you where the concern is with that. This is renewables on the top left panel. If you look at the blue section at the bottom, that's hydroelectricity, which is finite and has increased a little bit, but you can't keep damming rivers that don't exist. Above that is wind and solar and other renewables, and that has increased quite a lot, but it's only the top little bit of that. So renewables are increasing. That's good. But can it increase enough to replace fossil fuel? And is that happening? If you look at the fossil fuel increase as evidenced by CO2, on the top right panel, you can see, as we've said, that's already increasing. But what, of course, is happening is that renewables are being added to fossil fuel, so that the total energy use in the planet is increasing faster than it ever has in history. Renewables are not replacing fossil fuel. That's very concerning. And that is not what we hear from governments. They say we're moving a transition using natural gas, and it will reduce coal, and we'll end up using less energy, fossil fuel energy, and we'll end up by 2050 with renewables. Now, where's the evidence for that? Well, we'd like to see it, and I don't think you can say it's never going to happen, but it's deeply concerning that energy use is escalating because, as Bill Rees, who's the father of the global footprint, says, any energy use is in one way or other doing some damage to the environment, and that's an important thing to think about. Next, please. This all supports Jevons paradox, which I learned was an economic concept. Jevon was a British economist who said that in the 19th century, whenever there are technological improvements that increase efficiency, they lead to increased consumption. So what we're seeing is humans acting out what they've always done. If a commodity becomes cheaper and easier to use, then humans will use more of it. So allowing renewable energy to increase and not stopping fossil fuel with some legislation is heading in the wrong direction. So I say that because I think let there be no doubt that we should have deep concern about what's happening in the future, and particularly for children. Next. If you look at the IPCC representative concentration pathways, therefore, from what I've shown you, you can see that we're actually heading for the worst possible case, which is business as usual. And that is going to increase CO2 levels to around 1200. And data which I won't show you from our institute shows that mammals exposed to those levels in utero, around 900, particularly mice, which is where the studies are done, end up with lungs which are impaired in their function, and cerebral function, which is impaired. We don't know that that's going to happen in humans, but it's deeply concerning. And we don't want that to happen to children in the future. If you look at the shared socioeconomic pathways, again, we're heading, at this stage, we're probably heading for SSP 8.5, where the temperatures increase about 5.5 degrees. Even the UN, which is a little bit optimistic about this, has said that the end of the century currently we're heading for 3 to 4 degrees. So somewhere up there is the reality. Next, please. Meanwhile, let's look at the causes of death of children. As a paediatrician, I think I've seen all of these, and these are the WHO data from the world in 2021, the latest that's available. And the arrows point to all of the conditions: neonatal preterm birth, respiratory conditions, congenital birth defects are actually increased as well, malaria and diarrheal diseases. All of those things, there is evidence that with climate change, they're going to get worse. So all of those, as climate changes, more children as a rate will die, which is really worrying. Next, please. This is the work that Melinda's already touched on, and I'm just going to talk about some of the metrics of that, which is a paper which we published last year. The outstanding problems are respiratory disease and also preterm birth. Why respiratory disease? Because we're open to the world. Our lungs are open to pollution and infection, and whereas other parts of the body are shielded from it by not being open to the air. With the area of a human lung is about as large as a tennis court, is often quoted. So it's not surprising that respiratory disease is one of the greatest areas of concern for children. Next. If you look at the odds ratios on the bottom axis of each of these three panels, preterm birth shows the greatest increase for temperature in terms of odds ratios, and that finding is relatively new. So higher temperatures are going to mean more children will be born early. Children born early are more likely to have lung disease and have impairments to their development, and severe preterm children often have other damage. I was a neonatologist for a few years, and I've seen that many times. Also, respiratory disease, the odds ratios are less, but they're still highly significant. And morbidity and mortality for infants and children also increased. The odds ratio is a little lower, but they are increased with increasing temperature. Next, please. Oh, I showed just before. Oh, no, that's all right. In this slide, which is air pollution, which particularly affects both respiratory and perinatal disease, you can see that in the little box at the top for respiratory, the nitrogen oxides, which are increasing, particularly in cities, because a lot of it comes from internal combustion engines, and PM2.5 both have quite high odds ratios as levels go up, and PM2.5 also affects preterm delivery, probably because of toxins that are taken in, lung disease, all sorts of things like that, and some of which are indirect. We don't necessarily understand all that information, but there's no doubt that these factors are related. Next, please. Air quality, unfortunately, is going to get worse, and it's going to get worse in the places that are already stressed and least able to cope with looking after children. This is work done by a collaborator of ours, Sam Heff-Neal, and it was published in Nature in 2015, showing using satellite data that the increase in PM2.5 had a predictable increase in infant mortality. So an increase of 10 micrograms per cubic meter caused an increase in infant mortality of 9%. And he calculated, and his team calculated at the time, that around 450,000 increased deaths were due to air pollution at that stage. Given that air pollution is getting worse, that's probably increasing now. The panels on the left show the world with air pollution baseline, and the first one, early 21st century. This is increases from baseline, and you can see, again, it's the equatorial regions where are most affected. And as time goes by, that will get worse, because one of the things climate change does is cause stagnation of air in equatorial regions. So those places that are already compromised will have air conditions which are going to get a lot worse on these projections. Next. So I think Melinda has shown that from birth through to adulthood, exposures are going to be harmful to children. So every organ is involved, although there's not good evidence for that based on the analysis that we did. There are evidence from regional places suggesting that every organ will be involved. And unfortunately, temperature will get worse and air pollution will get worse. And at this stage, the reason I stress the Cape Grim data and the renewables is that there is no evidence that we're doing enough to even shift from that. And that's one of the things that we have to do for children is say, if you care about children, we really have to do something. And children have been left out of this equation, and there's very little data about it. Even at the UN, there's not a lot of talk about and not a lot of information about the actual calculations about what's going to happen to children in the future. Next. As we've pointed out, and Melinda's pointed out, most of the children that are going to be born in the next by 2100 will be born in low and middle income countries, and in particular with sub-Saharan Africa, 3.7 to 5.1 billion children will be born there. The mortality rates are already the highest there. The population's increasing fastest, and the capacity to deal with this situation is the most concerning, because 22 of the 26 low-income countries in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. Next, please. And this shows the expected number of childhood deaths under the age of 1 in a study that we did, showing that the blue dots and the green dots, particularly the blue, are from sub-Saharan Africa, where where there is a high poverty index on the lower axis and increasing mortality related. So again, it's deeply concerning for children in the future. Next. And this is where the poverty index is greatest. Again, it's in the same regions. Next. So as Melinda's already said, the projections from the United Nations and also from WHO in collaboration show mortality rates from infants and children that are going down very nicely because they all use, as Melinda said, retrospective data. They do not take into account what happens after 2022 or 2022 on that side. I think what you've seen is pretty clear that mortality rates and ill health will increase quite a lot in children, unfortunately. We've started an analysis on that in just the recent weeks and using some metrics. Next slide, please. Based on a paper from the Netherlands, using the socioeconomic pathway 2 and 3, which 2 is quite middle of the road. 3 is getting worse because it's looking at the impacts of other factors than climate change on mortality. What we did was combine that into looking as a metric to find out what's happening by 2043. And you can see that the medium impact produces a really large increase in infant mortality, child mortality as well, of course. And SSP3, which is not the worst case scenario, but we've got the metrics to calculate that, and we will be in the next few weeks looking at what's happened in the future. But I think it's pretty obvious from this that the UN's figures are very optimistic. Why are they like that? Because they've been projected from existing data, and I think probably there's not an incentive to find out how bad things are. I'm not sure why that is, but I think it's the one thing which is not being talked about at the CPD is that things are going to get a lot worse for children. I think why is it important? Well, none of us want to have a world where children die or have high morbidity. Next, please. So climate change and population dynamics will adversely impact child health. I don't think there's any question about that. We absolutely have to have adaptation measures to protect children as climate gets worse. But if we don't do enough as a global population of humans, then eventually the situation will get so bad that the adaptation procedures will be overrun by the climate change and increases like we've seen. So we need accurate mortality predictions, because if we're going to do something, we have to understand the problem. We need to know what's going to happen, and we need to do something immediately, because we'll miss the opportunity. And I think we know that, but this is based entirely on what's going to happen to children. I think there's enough information to say that if we care about the future, we care about children. We need to look after them, and we're not really taking enough interest in developing research, which we need, and certainly mitigation measures, which are global. But in the meantime, we've got to make sure that the UN, WHO, UNICEF continue to get funding. That obviously has been a problem that we know about in the last month or two. I think all other countries need to get together to make sure that we keep the demographic health survey data going so that we know what's going to happen. So we absolutely need adaptation measures for all countries, including wealthy countries, to protect children from what's happening. And UN and WHO, they're the leadership. They're the only group in the world that has global representation, and that they can provide the leadership. And I think that we need to support that. And governments need to do what is needed. They must legislate re-climate and re-energy use. And big businesses have to be regulated by governments. They can't be left to do what they want to do. Thank you very much. Oh, just one last slide, if you wouldn't mind. Just our team. I think in particular, I want to pay respect to Corey Bradshaw, who's done a lot of the modelling and is a co-leader. He leads the modelling. And of course, Melinda, whom you've met, plus Mara West, who's our Indigenous representative, and a lot of new students and other postdocs and workers who have contributed to our work. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete.